I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You were there once in your life.
Hey people, Trish Wood here, and this is Trish Wood is Critical. And boy, are we thinking critically this week after the loss of that little submersible had the whole world holding its breath for a number of days with some pretty, not round-the-clock news coverage, but some pretty breathless news coverage accompanying the disappearance of that little submersible that had gone down to photograph the Titanic with 5 people aboard, some of them tourists. It was quite an experience for me watching it because I felt like something hinky had happened almost from day one, which I will explain to you in a minute. And it does show again how bad the mainstream media are at covering these things. I was really disappointed in the level of questioning of the experts they had on multiple shows, both here and in the UK, where I sometimes watch GB News on my YouTube. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. It's a really, really interesting story. Even if you were not following this little Titan submersible that disappeared, there's some very interesting things to discuss about how it was covered and what the experts said and didn't say, and how the American Coast Guard and Navy may have been conscripted into a bit of a fib. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I'm really proud to have on the show today 2 people whom I admire very much. Sean Buckley and Michelle Leduc-Catlin are here to unpack, reminisce about the National Citizens Inquiry. As you know, I was the spokesperson for them for a very short period of time. I was happy to do it, but when I realized the hugeness of the task, I stepped aside and Michelle stepped into the role. And I have to say, she did it better than I ever could. She was working night and day for weeks and weeks and weeks and brought a lot of humanity to the role, which was necessary. So here's why we're talking to them. Aside from the fact that it was a huge achievement and something our country can be proud of, I bumped into Michelle at an event last week, and she very quickly started talking about how traumatized she was after hearing all of the evidence and the testimonies from Canadians who'd been harmed by the public policy around lockdowns and vaccines. And I thought, you know what? Yeah, I get it. It's something reporters experience as well when you're going to spend intense time without a lot of time to decompress around disturbing events, which was my life for many, many years. So I know how you can't, it's really hard to readjust when it ends. So I got the idea to invite Michelle Leduc-Catlin and also Sean Buckley, whose brainchild the National Citizens Inquiry was. And it's a really fascinating interview and eliminates so much we need to be talking about with regard to the response to COVID-19 and what a complete shit show it was. Pardon my French. I'm not allowed to say that anymore, but yeah, we're going to have a nice, deep discussion with them about what happened at the NCI and how they're feeling about it now and what the future holds. And the fact that they did, at least in my opinion, move the ball down the field. Sometimes the citizens, especially now, we've got to take matters into our own hands. The government wasn't going to do an inquiry because they knew that an honorable inquiry would find them guilty of a lot of malfeasance. So rather than waiting around for nothing or a corrupt inquiry like the POEC, they did their own, and it was a huge success. So we're going to learn all about that. I'm just going to do a quick pitch here. So we are funded by our listeners and readers of my Substack. Substack is the primary place where you can come and exchange ideas with each other and report on things that or tell us your opinion of things that I'm reporting on or talking about. We are on Substack because it is a free speech platform. They don't censor anything, and lots of places do. So if you're still on Patreon, please move over. If you're on PayPal, please move over and I'll meet you there. And we do premium content as well. So look for that. I've got a new little bit coming up in the next day or so for you. And I'm going to release a document today more generally, I think, about the submarine issue, because I've collected a lot of really interesting video and stories about it. I'll be posting that probably at the end of the day today or tomorrow when I get it done. I am on Twitter at Wood Reporting. Lots of fun over there. And I have a website, which is trishwoodpodcast.com. Do tell your friends. And do, if you feel like it, if there's a particularly good episode that you like, let's do a call to action. Send it out to some people, especially if we're talking about something and maybe you want to change their mind. So feel free to do that. We'd be really grateful for that too. I was at two interesting events last Thursday and Friday night. On Thursday night, I went to a Jordan Peterson event. He was being given an award by the JCCF for his courage around free speech, yay, and freedom. It's the George Jonas Award, and obviously he was there to pick it up, and then he gave one of his interesting talks. It was kind of a banquet thingy. So that was really fun. Interesting to see him. I've never seen him in person before. He's a little smaller than I thought. But he wears really expensive suits now. Wow. And with cowboy boots. So I wasn't expecting that either. I thought he was some rumpled old professorial guy, but no, he looked like a beautiful bespoke suit, maybe from a London tailor or something, and cowboy boots, maybe from Austin, Texas. But yeah, he looked very spiff. And then the other night, the following night, out in Hamilton, I was at an event for Vera Sharap's documentary about equating what happened to us during the COVIDian times with what happened in the run-up to the Holocaust. So, and she is a Holocaust survivor. She's been on my show. I was one of the first people to interview her about making that connection. And there are some similarities, especially from the early days of the Nazi Party running Germany, where the science people and the doctors all signed up to the Nazi Party. So that was wonderful, and it was a really fun night. And I know that at that event, because I met some of you, there were some show listeners who went there specifically to meet up, and I loved meeting each and every one of you. That's the kind of stuff that makes my heart sing. And I'm always really, really grateful to meet the listeners to this podcast, because you're all wonderful people, each and every one of you. I'm so lucky. It was great. So thank you for coming, and thank you for supporting Vera's film. I know she really, really appreciates it. So before we get into NCI, I'm just going to do a little bit of forensic analysis of not just the sinking of this submersible or the making it irretrievable, but the media coverage of it. So this is what happened. Just weirdly, fortuitously, I had been the night before the Titan went missing, scrolling through YouTube and watching videos of diving accidents. I mean, what are the odds of that? I mean, how obscure for me to be doing that. It was crazy. So when the Titan went missing, I had a pretty good idea of how important the pressure issue is down at that level in the ocean. It's actually everything, right? The difference between the pounds per square inch pressure up here and down there, I think up here it's like 14 pounds per square inch. I know you guys will correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, it's 14.7. I Googled that. And down near where the Titanic sits, it's 6,000, right? So it's 14.7 versus 6,000. So that kind of pressure basically makes your body kind of explode. And it can make some little submersibles explode too if they're not properly built. So I knew that it was very, very likely, based on some of these videos I'd watched, that there may have been a pressure issue around the Titan. As I understand it, and as they announced at the time, the Titan was in its descent at 1 hour and 45 minutes, which is really deep, but not quite at the Titanic wreck yet. All communications and all systems connected that they can monitor from the ship above ceased communicating. It just ended, right? And so I thought, when I heard that initially, oh, well, it must have been one of these implosions. It must have been a pressurized implosion. The hull gave way on this. little device that I think they were using some kind of, it was a new kind of a shell. And it was one that had been criticized by a number of people over the years as being not strong enough to withstand the pressure down below. And there was also an allegation, it was a carbon fiber wrap is what they call it, that it hadn't even really been properly pressure tested. Here I was thinking, well, it very likely imploded. And then the news coverage took off. And what happens with these stories, like Malaysian Air and various things that sort of pick up steam and kind of take over our lives while they're underway, is that a new narrative emerged. The idea that it imploded, which would mean that there's no one to rescue, it's over, maybe we can recover bits of the little vessel itself, but there's definitely nobody left to save. That's just what those things are like. And if you want to know more about that, I would recommend you Google for videos about the Byford diving accident. That's an extraordinary story about what happens to a body under that kind of pressure. It's one of the most gruesome videos ever, actually. But it does tell an interesting story about how pressure works on the body. So I knew from having seen that video and others the night before that this was really dire. So the media picks up on the story. Maybe they're still alive. Maybe it didn't implode. Maybe it's sitting on the bottom. Maybe it's sitting on the top. Not much evidence for that stuff either, actually. And all of these assets are then deployed to look for this little submersible. There was a 19-year-old kid on it, a couple of billionaires, and some other people, a French explorer and the guy who owned the company as well, who I think was piloting it. The company, which was called Ocean Gate. So now there's going to be a new Gate story. You know how they add Gate to every story where there's a sort of a controversy? So this is going to be like Ocean Gate, because so much seems to have gone wrong here that it will likely end up being, for sure, lawsuits and probably, I suspect, maybe criminal charges for the other people at the company, possibly. So anyway, so the narrative changes from the logical idea about what might have happened into this kind of fantasy, which James Cameron talked about on the BBC, and I agree with him, about how they were maybe going to rescue people from the bottom of the ocean. They didn't know how they do it. All these assets are deployed. And it went on for, I don't know, like 4 days. Oh, they have 90 hours of oxygen. It's a race against time. The narrative became a race against time. And I was watching the coverage and thinking, they're asking really stupid questions, because is it true that if it's only sitting on the bottom and nothing bad has happened except that they can't maneuver out of there, that all of their gear is down? All of their comms are down, all the transponders, everything's down? No, that makes absolutely no sense. But yet it persisted. And in a weird way, you'll notice if you go back and review any of the coverage, that's the story the media wanted it to be. And the Navy seemed to be, I can't remember if it was a Navy spokesman or a Coast Guard spokesman, but they were kind of playing along with it. I'm not saying they shouldn't have sent assets. They probably should have. I don't know how you don't, if there's even a remote possibility that they're alive. But nobody wanted to talk about the most obvious possibility, which is that the little submersible had imploded. So today, and I believe he may have said this, and this is Friday, I'm talking, he may have started saying this last night. James Cameron, who is a really clever cat and has dived down to the Titanic, I think 33 times, has designed these little submarines, said that he was told on the day that the story first broke that the Navy had picked up at the very time that the communications from Titan ceased, a massive explosive noise in the area, sort of confirming that it was a pressurized explosion. But they weren't talking about it. I mean, the Navy was not saying that. In fact, another story took root, which is that they were hearing these knocks coming from the seafloor every 30 minutes. And maybe it's Morse code and they're tapping out SOS and it's proof of life. And I mean, it got very, very dramatic. And so now we're left with this really weird situation, which is that no one was banging and they died at exactly the time they went missing. And yet we had this kind of fantasy news coverage for 4 days. And it was partly enabled by the fact that the media will not ask hard, rational, and logical questions when these things are underway. Really a terrible, terrible story. And now what's coming out about OceanGate and the reckless, irresponsible way that they approach safety is really, really bad. People are saying, including Piers Morgan, oh, these are brave explorers and we should celebrate them. And, you know, why is everybody being so critical? But here's the thing. I don't think that the people who paid money to go on that boat or on that submersible, except for maybe one of the billionaires who'd done a lot of things like that, saw themselves as explorers. They were tourists going down to see something cool, right? They weren't doing an exploration of anything. Lots of people have been down to the Titanic. So that's a garbage idea. This was a tourist dive. And those people were owed way better, number one, communication from the chap who, Stockton Rush, the chap who owned the company, about problems that they'd had and were having, than they got. It would be like going on a ride at the CNE and they lied about not passing a safety inspection or something. I mean, it's really awful. There was a fellow who worked for the company who left and wrote a letter saying he quit over the safety issues, mostly around the hull, not necessarily surviving a pressurized problem. So I think that this is going to be a much bigger story. I think maybe there will be criminal charges laid against anybody who's remaining in that company. Maybe not, but, and they do sign these big waivers, but I don't think a waiver will protect the company if they were lying about previous problems and current problems that they were having with that submersible. It just doesn't make sense. So who weighed in on that? Dr. Ballard, who was the guy who actually found the Titanic in 1985. I was working in a newsroom when it happened, and it was so exciting. I think I even cried. I mean, listen, people who were born after 1985 don't know that we didn't know where the Titanic was since the day she sunk, right? We didn't know that. So seeing her to come into view on a video camera was very, very exciting for me. So he's weighed in, and James Cameron has weighed in, and I think James Cameron is making a lot of sense. David Lockridge is the guy, former Royal Navy Marine engineer who quit the company, wrote a letter saying they've got problems and that the problems were with this capsule in which people were sitting in a little tin can. Yeah, I think this is going to end up being a really big story. But I will also say that somehow the media was complicit in this because they wanted a certain story. I don't know why the Navy didn't talk publicly about the explosion that was heard an hour and 45 minutes after the Titan entered the ocean. And at the same time, all the comms and communications devices, etc., went dead. I don't know why they didn't talk about that at the news conferences, but they didn't. And then the other question remaining is, what was the knocking about? What was making those knocking sounds? Clearly, those were also misinterpreted. So very, very bad. Let me say this. I love adventure stories. I love Everest stories. I love big wave surfing. I follow those shows like the 100-Foot Wave. And people are likening those events to this event. But here's the difference. People who climb Mount Everest and get stranded at the top are only hurting themselves, right? They're not schlepping 5 other people or 4 other people up there with them to die because they've made a mistake. I mean, a bad guide could do that, but most people choose their guides wisely, and they're not putting 4 other people at risk the way Mr. Rush did, Stockton Rush. So that's one part of it. But here's the other thing that's kind of egregious about it too. It's that I come from a long line of mariners. My grandfather was a master mariner on the BC coast, as I've said before, built boats, fished up at Rivers Inlet. And one thing that you do when you're entering, Mother Ocean, who can be trouble, as we know, you make sure everything's working. You don't cut corners on safety. And people who are serious people about the ocean itself or deep diving in the ocean, divers are very, very, very careful about their gear and safety, marine safety, submariner safety, diving safety. They're all very, very serious about that. And this guy was not. And so that's kind of offensive. This was not an accident that was a surprise or shouldn't have happened. It was an accident waiting to happen, no question about that. And that's, I think a lot of people like James Cameron and Dr. Ballard from the Titanic, he also does submariner explorations, find it offensive that somebody would be so absolutely reckless. And not for research. This is not a research vessel per se. He's saying it was a tourist deal. They weren't researching anything. What a terrible loss. And I think the postscript is that this young boy who was on it, 19, didn't want to go. He went with his father, and he went because his father really wanted him to go. And so he said yes because it was Father's Day. So mom left behind now is going to have a real psychodrama, isn't she? Her husband's dead. Her husband encouraging the boy to go along means the boy's dead too. So she's mourning her kid and mourning her husband, but she's mad at her husband. And oh God, I don't even want to think about that. I don't want to think about it. So this is what happens when you're not a serious person. And based on everything I've read and seen about Stockton Rush, he was not a serious person. And I was surprised to hear James Cameron say that they were friends. That really surprises me, actually. But I think it's only going to get worse from here on out. Okay, that is my story about this massive story that happened during the past week. It exposed the stupidity of OceanGate, the company that made this little submersible, and the stupidity of legacy media covering it, who bought into a story that actually could not have been true. If you actually examine the evidence, could not have been true. So I will send out, if you're interested in looking at this further, I'm going to do a Substack either today or tomorrow with links and some of the videos I've looked at, and I'll include one on the Byford diving disaster if you've got the stomach for it. It's pretty grim. The other thing that James Cameron said, just to make this even worse, is that he believed that this little vessel had sensors in it to show if the vessel was starting to crack under pressure, heading to a catastrophic event. It's very likely that those sensors went off, and I'll tell you how we know that, because the ballast that is strapped to the bottom of that little vessel was released and is sitting on the ocean floor kind of unperturbed, like it didn't blow up. So if it was attached when the little vessel imploded, it would be much more damaged than it is. So what that says is that they may have had a few seconds to fully understand that something was wrong before the end happened. So that's also pretty awful. But that looks like the timeline, right? I think that's as close as we're going to get for the next few weeks about what actually happened, is that they had a warning, released the ballast, then imploded about an hour and 45 minutes in, and that the Navy recorded the sound and heard the sound of it exploding and didn't really say anything publicly for 4 days about that, because there was another narrative going on. So who knows why that happened. Anyway, from one catastrophe to another, I am so thrilled to have these two on today. I had the privilege of working with Sean and a little bit with Michelle as the NCI was coming together. It felt in the best possible way, a little bit like flying by the seat of your pants for a good cause. Those are things I really like. I like a little bit of chaos in my life because then I get to conquer it and feel good. And that's what they did. That no one ever would have thought they could have pulled this off, but they did with a lot of grace. And they've kind of come back from, looking into the abyss, the heart of darkness around some COVID-19 policy, and a little bit about how our neighbors treated us and how the vaccine injured have been treated and the unvaccinated. This is a very dark history for our country, and they've exposed it. And they talk about it very, very eloquently. So I'm super proud to have them on. And here is my interview with Sean Buckley, who's a lawyer, in case you're wondering, and Michelle Leduc-Catlin. Hi, Sean and Michelle. How are you?
Good. Thank you.
I'm good, Trish. Thanks.
Great. So I think I want to start by asking you about, it's something I heard from Michelle, who I bumped into at an event with Jordan Peterson the other night, which sounds very la-di-da. Not my life at all, but in that moment I was there. And we were talking about the experience of kind of living through NCI and the volumes and volumes of evidence and testimony, and how that landed with you, both of you, as human beings. Because I know from being a reporter who traveled the world covering traumatic events that you kind of do what you need to do, and then you go home and you're like, wow, that was really upsetting. And I got the sense from you, Michelle, that that's maybe a little bit of what's happening to you now after experiencing all of the heartache that's happened from coast to coast in this country as a result of COVID public health policy.
Yeah. I remember the conversation you and I had before I started out on this journey. And you had said that something like that would happen. And you were right. It's actually really hard to put into words. It's like there's all this pain and suffering that you're hearing about. And for me, I listen to every witness in a way that they would have the experience of being heard. So I wanted to bear witness to what they had to say. And I know that one of our, coping mechanisms was to cry and hug each other at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But then, as you say, you come back to what used to be normal, and it doesn't seem normal anymore.
Yeah. It's a little bit, I did a book with soldiers. I know it's not that extreme, but when they describe coming back from a war zone where they were fighting without a lot of emotion, that when they come home and they're kind of walking through Walmart and everybody's behaving like there's no war going on in Iraq or Afghanistan, wherever they were from, they'd feel like, I'm distanced from these people now. I've seen something that they're not acknowledging. Sean, I'm wondering if that's kind of the experience that you had too. How did you come through it?
Well, actually, I don't think anyone has come through it. So it's curious. So Ottawa was the last one, and my wife Teresa and I would get home, and for a little over a week, you'd just be doing something and you'd just start weeping. Like it was the strangest thing, but there was so much emotion. I mean, there were times, and Michelle will attest to this, there were times when the whole room was weeping, where you couldn't not weep. And the commissioners, I saw one of the commissioners last week, they're all experiencing the exact same thing. And we saw the AV team last week, and they're feeling, literally, it's funny, Sherry was describing what you just described with soldiers as a disconnect. On Ottawa, when Sheila Lewis testified, and she's the lady that is being refused an organ transplant because she's not vaccinated, although the tests show she has robust natural immunity. And she's pleading. She's saying, I just want to live. I just want to see my grandchildren grow up. Well, I was the counsel leading her. I had to leave the room afterwards. Because I had to go out and cry somewhere, and I didn't want to do it in front of everyone.
It's true. I actually just wrote about this. I just put out my last story about the last set of hearings, and I was reviewing my notes on Sheila and my memories about Sheila. And I think, when you know something like that is happening, and it is similar to what you're saying about soldiers, but when you know something like that is happening, and you walk around and everybody's just going about their business. It's really hard to reconcile those two worlds.
Absolutely. And it's just to sort of chime in on that point that after I wrote the book, even, I was struggling after taking these firsthand accounts from soldiers many of whom had never spoken about their war experience before. And like you two, you are witnessing, it's almost a chaplaincy. You have to witness for people, don't you? What they experienced, especially at a time of great dishonesty. So when the book was published, that's kind of when I had a meltdown, which I don't talk about because I always said, gee, it's way worse for them than me. Why am I talking about how I feel about it? Whoops, but I talk about it not to say how empathetic or sympathetic I am, but rather to say, if it's that bad for me secondhand, imagine what they're going through. Right?
Absolutely.
Right?
And I also think it's really important to recognize how difficult it is, because I think this is why people are unwilling to face things, because on some level they know that there's something not right and that they will have to avoid confronting it.
Just on that point, because one thing that I didn't expect to experience during the hearings was that the vaccine injured people literally are treated like lepers. And so you have somebody on the stand and they're just describing being horrifically injured, and you're in complete empathy mode. But they're also then describing how they, so they'll be going to the hospital with significant symptoms. It almost doesn't matter what you have. What's going on, they tell you have anxiety and send you home. We have this system that can't acknowledge that we have vaccine injury. Like we're in total denial. So could you imagine having just a horrible, debilitating condition and also fearing that you're going to die, and the medical system is treating you like, well, you've got mental health issues. And I wasn't ready for that. And so you feel helpless, and it's still going on. Like you want to do something, but you can't.
Well, I think it's about these testimonies revealing something about our country that we didn't know was there. And right. And I feel that this is the life-changing part of being awake through COVID-19, is that we are seeing cruelty that other people either ignore or push down or don't see as cruelty at all. And I find that very, very kind of disabling for me. I'm still trying to find a way to navigate through a world and a country where they would deny a human being a chance to live because she didn't get a vaccine that doesn't prevent transmission anyway. I mean, it's absurd and cruel in the extreme. So, I wonder if were there other points, were there other testimonies or evidence that made you think differently about the country in which you live?
There were many, for me. I mean, there was the woman who got the injection, dropped dead at the pharmacy, and the people who continued to line up to get the shot.
Oh, yeah. That's a horror movie. That's like a horror movie.
Oh yeah. I mean, and that's the thing, is there are horror stories. There's the woman, Marjolina Repo in Saskatoon, who, an elderly woman unable to wear a mask medically, who was, thrown off of buses, who went to the doctor's office where she felt completely in a foreign land because everybody there was masked, more interested in her mask than anything else. She went for a diagnosis. Her doctor said he had a diagnosis for her, and she asked him to remove his mask. And to his credit, he did. And she said for a minute, he was a human being again. And he told her that she had stage 4 cancer. So she left there. She wanted to go to a coffee shop. And she said, I just wanted to go in a corner and have a coffee and cry. And when she got to the coffee shop, they not only declined to serve her, but they berated her for not having a mask, even though, again, medically mask exempt. So she goes home and she pours out this story on Facebook. And she wakes up the next day to hundreds of hate-filled messages, including death threats.
Wow. I don't know what country I'm living in right now.
And there's story after story, by the way. I mean, there's no shortage of those kinds of stories.
Yeah. Sean, what about you? Did being witness to these tragedies affect the way you view the country you live in, or the people that you call, your fellow Canadians?
Oh, well, that's tough to say because, you were talking earlier about, how interesting it is that we're seeing cruelty, and we're seeing cruelty at a level we have never, ever experienced before. And yet, as you say, some Canadians don't see it at all, and some support the actions quite strongly. One thing that I found extremely disturbing, and it came out very strongly with Scarlett Martin's evidence in Toronto, she was a paramedic, was how unvaccinated people were treated with complete disdain and got a substandard level of care just because they were unvaccinated. And I wasn't anticipating that from the medical community, just like I wasn't anticipated that the vaccine people that are injured are absolutely treated like lepers because, I'm in a profession, I'm a lawyer, and we've got specific codes of conduct that I believed we took seriously, although I don't want to talk about the law profession and COVID, but I wasn't expecting the lack of professionalism in the medical system. And it's just part of this cruelty. Like, it seems that something came out of us because of the fear that we hadn't ever experienced before. Now, the flip side is there's people that just acted with caring and love. And the most important experience from the NCI, here we're going through all these hearings and people are present and people are watching online, and something very different happened, like listening to Canadians tell their stories, listening, just the idea that somebody actually had permission to speak. I mean, remember, these are forbidden topics still.
Yeah.
We had witness after witness after witness drop out just on the eve of testifying because they were afraid of repercussions, either losing their job or, more importantly, their friends and family, giving them grief still for even speaking about these things. So we're still living in this bubble, and we're still hurting the vaccine injured by not treating them with respect and care and love, and even acknowledging what they have. So, yeah, I now believe that people can be much more cruel than before. But then the flip side is, and Michelle will talk about this too, is this community formed, like this extremely loving community formed, and not just the people there, the people online. Why the NCI became so popular, and I mean, I just think God actually was moving and letting us know we're not alone.
Yeah.
We no longer have to be afraid, and we can speak about what's happening. It's given us permission to have a dialogue again.
If I could just say this, I talk about it fairly regularly on the podcast that I am a recovering alcoholic, and proud of that, oddly, because I come from a family where, it washed over us like a tsunami. So some people made it out and some people didn't make it out. But what you just said, Sean, is so interesting, because what happens in 12-step programs that keep us sober is that one of our slogans is "You're not alone." It's repeated forever. We listen to testimonies from other alcoholics, and we remind each other we're not alone. And that's why we get together in rooms once or twice a week. And also, ironically, those fora were closed by the COVIDian public health officials too, right? So a lot of us relapsed, including my son, who I talked about on the show recently. But it's very, very interesting that there are certain things that are common in all of these tragedies that rearrange our kind of our moral compass, right? That if we listen and if we witness and if we show up and tell people they're not alone, wonderful things happen. And wouldn't it have been great if those things had been precipitated by public health instead of, this kind of dedicated bunch of citizens who created a wonderful moment. Sorry for going on, but I just felt like to throw that in.
You're basically speaking about the importance of community, and here instead we were locked down. I mean, provinces had the liquor stores open, but they shut down AA meetings and they isolated us. I mean, if we really were going through this awful pandemic, and that instead of really just something that affected a subset of population in a specific age group, but let's say we were going through something terribly scary, that's when we actually need the community.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing about that's becoming apparent is that some lives were worth saving and some weren't. So when I say that I know people who relapsed because of Zoom only recovery meetings, I also know of people who died. And I think we all know, and you would have heard evidence about people who died in service of the COVIDian public health narrative, right? It's that those were the only lives we're saving, were people who might get COVID. Everybody else could get cancer and all the other terrible things that happened as a result of loneliness and isolation and poverty and penury and all that stuff, right? So that's also something I want to explore with you, is this hyper focus on viral suppression, which did not work anyway, against the needs and the lives of all the other things that happen in our community. Did you think about that, Michelle? Was that a sort of a theme there?
I've certainly have thought about it in the last couple of years. During the hearings, I wouldn't say I was thinking so much about that because we were hyper-focused on all things COVID. But I think it's something that a lot of people still haven't come to terms with, that we weren't asking logical questions like, why aren't the AA meetings, why aren't people able to meet in AA, but they could meet at Walmart,
Yeah.
So I don't know how to answer that because I don't think people yet are out of that myopic view.
No, I don't think they are either. I guess the idea that they were making decisions without risk-benefit ratios is also kind of what I'm getting at, right, Sean? That nobody was calculating if lockdowns were going to kill people, and they should have been. Right?
Oh, well, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the cure was worse than the supposed illness. Just when you were starting to ask Michelle that question, it just popped into my head. Who gets to, like, what I'm wrestling with is how can it be that we don't get to choose at all? I mean, here we were, locked in our homes. People are rational. So, for example, and they just intuitively will adjust their risk profile based on the evidence around them. So, if you have no police enforcement of the highways, on a hot sunny day, people might be driving 20, 25 kilometers over the speed limit, and in a pack, and it's perfectly safe. Now, if it's raining, they might be driving below the speed limit, and if it's snowing, they definitely will. And they just intuitively adjust, like we just do this. And if we were being told the truth, and we weren't being deliberately put into a state of fear, I wonder how we would have acted. Because I think all of us would have, tried to be cautious and adjust our behavior based on the risk that we saw, and we'd adjust it as the facts changed. But I just find it, amazing. And I think a large part of the trauma that we're experiencing is because we actually were treated like we had no rights at all. I mean, we were locked in our homes. Michelle and I were on a podcast earlier this week, and Scarlett Martin was on there also, and she's back as a paramedic. She had lost her job for a long period of time because she wasn't vaccinated. And she shared with us that some of the healthcare professionals are referring, and these are the people that got vaccinated, they're referring to it as needle rape. And they have needle rape because they were forced to take it. They took it. But it wasn't voluntary, and they feel violated. And then a lot of them are also, like she related that some of them were saying, well, if I got raped, we would, do the tests and I'd know if I'm injured. I'd know if I'd caught something. But with this, I don't know. We're all just waiting. Like, so a lot of them are aware that it's like a ticking time bomb. Am I damaged? Am I not? Am I going to be dying suddenly? Am I not? Am I getting turbo cancer? Am I not? But the interesting thing is that they feel violated. They like even the term needle rape is quite an interesting term. So I think another part of all of this, and it definitely, seeped out during the NCI, was this moral distress about how we were treated. Like we're damaged on a spiritual level, regardless of whether there's any physical consequence.
I think that's why so many people are struggling with it, because that is a much harder place to go than determining if you're physically damaged. And I think that for so many people, because as Sean said, because people were put into such a intense state of fear, they just did what they were told to do. And so it's like, it's so exhausting to be thinking about it all the time. And, I think it was intentional, but to be put in that state of fear all the time is so exhausting, just to add on to all of the rest of life's pressures, that if you're given a simple solution like take this needle or wear a mask, it feels like, okay, I've handled that. And so you don't have to face that.
I think that's so smart, Michelle, and the corollary is not only do they get some psychic relief by using kind of like a talisman type mask, right, against the fear or against the bad thing, they also then get a resentment against people who aren't, right? That's it, right. That's the perfect thing. I interviewed the woman who wrote the book State of Fear almost 2 years ago now. She's a British journalist and terribly smart. And she exposed the behavioral sciences push to drive everybody crazy on behalf of public health so that they would then be more obedient. And what she said about it, which was I never forgot it, and it will stay with me forever. She said, it wasn't just that we fell to the fear campaign into a kind of strange medical tyranny. It was how fast it happened. It took no time at all to completely change what I thought was the culture and the nature of the country in which I live. I mean, it feels like it happened overnight for me. And apparently in the UK, it was the same. So she says, yeah.
Well, the interesting thing also, Trish, is, what about the children? Because what they witnessed was their parents being afraid of government, and how do we come back from that? So, I mean, let's just ignore all the damage done in schools by masking and schools closures and all of that. Like, I mean, we may not recover from that for 100 years until they all pass. Assuming we can have some sense of normality back in the schools, but what's going to be the effect going forward when we've had children experiencing this extreme state of fear and watching their parents fearing the government? Because we haven't ever experienced that before for anyone who's alive in Canada, except for the Aboriginal population.
Well, that's, Sean, I know you've talked about this in some of your opening statements, but the whole, when you've lowered the bar, that becomes the new normal, right? And you see young people today who don't flinch at still wearing a mask, or they don't think about that lockdown, a prison term, became completely normal and even a virtue. I mean, they don't even think about the things that were for us unthinkable.
I think that kids have been trained by their devices to be more obedient. That I just feel I can't actually make a scientific case for that. It's an intuitive judgment I've made, but I've certainly seen young people be some of the worst, most kind of coerced, obedient, frightened, anxious, and they should be the least because they have a very, very low risk of a bad outcome should they get COVID, which everybody's gonna anyway. But I think that maybe they're siloed worlds, their curated, self-curated social media feeds, their addiction to their cell phones, all kind of train the brain to not think largely in a moral way when confronted with some of this stuff, because that's just a theory, but I'm looking for a reason why the kids who should be saying, screw the man and big pharma is bad, the way we did when we were kids, are all like totally in with tyranny now and think it's cool, right? Like, it's just weird for me.
Yeah, it's definitely weird.
Sorry, Michelle.
No, go ahead, Sean.
Well, I was just going to, if I can chime in, Trish, like I might be the last one in Canada that doesn't have a cell phone. And I'm not on any social media. Yeah. And, I look, well, my wife says that's not true. She manages a Twitter account that I wouldn't even have the login for or know how to use. So I don't have, I'm not involved in social media. And even though like our generation, the expectation on communication has changed because of all this instant communication. So it's not just the young, like, and I 100% agree with you. I think culturally we have damaged ourselves. And if we could go back in time before the smartphone, a smart decision would be not to do this, but everything's changed for communications.
Yeah. And I think we're just obedient now. One of the things that bugs me, it seems not related, but I feel like it is now our relationships in this country and more generally in Western countries with even people we buy stuff from has changed in such a huge way. It's like the customer's always wrong. Line up here. Use this self-checkout. Don't be mean to our staff. And if you don't like it, you can leave. That's kind of, we're cattle now, right? So I feel that stuff is all connected in some way, that we've all been dehumanized, that started before the COVID pandemic happened, and we just kind of accepted it. So let's get to the nuts and bolts of. So I want to hear some of your stories from the road, Sean, and I'll ask you this just so people know. How did you get the idea? You're a very modest guy, but I know because I was involved in it for a minute and a half, that you were kind of the driving force behind this. So how did you get the idea? And I know what a sacrifice it was. Why did you work so hard to bring this wonderful thing to Canadians?
So, so it really has been a ride. Like for about, 7 months, it was dusk to dawn. We really didn't even have time to go for walks, and maybe the odd Sunday I wouldn't be working. But for me, Trish, what I can't get my head around is that we're vaccinating kids. I just call it jabbing kids. Yeah. And, my belief is that kids they're statistically more likely to die from a lightning strike than from being, from COVID. Yeah. And more likely to be violently murdered. And we wouldn't subject anyone to an experimental treatment that seems to be particularly dangerous to the young. So I think we're murdering children, and I can't, I experienced like everyone else, I cowered in my home in fear when this was going on. And then I saw the truckers, and it's just, okay, somebody's standing up. I've got to join that group of people that stand up. And they were punished, and that's okay. But it's, for me, we're murdering children, and so if any initiative, I'm going to get behind and try to do whatever I can to wake people up so we stop that madness. So that was my driving force, and you never know what's going to happen with an initiative. This one, God just took it and used it, and I don't even know. And, how do you even describe the NCI now? Because the administrative structure, as you know, Trish, is this small little group.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's still this small little group. We've probably had like 800 to 1,000 people volunteer and do different tasks.
Oh, that's great.
But what we've had is we've all just had this experience, and now a whole bunch of people are just doing their own things and feeling empowered. So I think Michelle will echo this. Is we feel like we've gone. For me, it was the most important experience of my life, most rewarding.
Yeah.
So most challenging, but most rewarding, just because of the experience that happened with a fairly large chunk of Canadians feeling they're not alone and feeling permission to speak again.
I think you're right. And I remember some of the early discussions we were having. And the idea, I feel that was so important in what you did, because the truckers were just ripped away from us. They made us feel Canadian. They made us feel hopeful. They made us feel, we can be together to, in peaceful protest against this thing. And then it ended in this tragic and, it was just brutal what happened with the bank accounts and the cops and the trenches. I mean, I'm still upset about it, but I feel like the NCI moved into that void a bit and gave people another reason to hope and to volunteer and to do something about what they just experienced. So props to you for doing that. Michelle, is that your take, that it kind of, it wasn't what the truckers did, but in a sense, it did give voice to people and bring them into rooms to be together?
Well, I think it built on the shoulders of the truckers who, I completely agree. I think we certainly built on the shoulders of giants in, picking up where the truckers left off. And I think for me, what was so exciting about the NCI was that it was professional. It was coming at it not from a side, but from let's get together. Let's talk about what did we do right? What did we do wrong? What could we do better? These were very innocent questions. And I think that for me, it was an olive branch to those people who were just looking at the truckers, or those people who were against the mandates as the enemy, and saying, hey, let's just look together. Let's look at what the evidence says. And I think because it was done so professionally, and in such an, what's the word? It wasn't an attack. Right. So it was in a very open, receptive way that people were able to listen and able to share the testimony with other people. And even just to say, have you heard about the National Citizens Inquiry? It's an opening. And I think what it became, as Sean said, it became something so much more. And I think it became a new muscle of democracy. A new way to exercise that muscle. And this, for me, this comes back to something that's really important to me, which is that we've been talking about rights for a long, long time, but we haven't been talking about responsibility. And as I agree with you that young people are kind of trained into submission, and they haven't had to think about their responsibilities. And if anything, this is a wake-up call. We need to take responsibility for our democracy, for our rights and freedoms, and for our country.
Yeah, I don't think they get it yet. And I think, nothing focuses the mind like the threat of going to war. And this generation has grown up without any kind of geopolitical threats on their doorstep, that at least that they recognize. So I think we do need to find a way for them to focus, and perhaps this is the way. Sean, I want to ask you about something you said, which is that people were kind of dropping out at the last minute because of fear. So what were they afraid of? What did they think was going to happen if they went public and spoke to you all?
Well, they actually were afraid that there would be retribution. And I spoke about this the odd time during some of the openings. So, it's interesting because now we're in June, but we were in March, April, and May when we were running these hearings. And so in March, April, and May of 2023, we're not in a crisis. The media isn't, pouring this fear porn down our throats 24/7 like we were. And life's returned to some normalcy. I mean, I think we all feel that things aren't normal, and they aren't the same because they aren't. But we would, like the first witness this happened to, she told me, well, I'm actually afraid that I'm either going to lose my job or, it's going to hurt my career advancement if I do this. We had people say, just the, that they're afraid that their family and friends basically will ostracize them socially and punish them socially for speaking out, which this is one of the things is here we are in June of 2023. There are still people I can't have a conversation with. And there are people you can't have a conversation with, Michelle. And Trish, there are people like family and friends you can't have a conversation with. Now, that's changing, and the NCI's made me a lot more bold. I just, I'm less willing to pretend the emperor has clothes when the emperor doesn't have clothes. But no, we had a lot of fear in these witnesses, which is, so we're not out of it. People are still being punished. There is, well, I mean, think about it. I spoke earlier about my surprise that the vaccine injured are being treated like lepers in our medical community because officially we cannot accept that they exist. We don't have vaccine injury in Canada in any meaningful way, so these people can't exist. And yet we have the healthcare staff who know that they exist, and they're suffering all this moral distress over it. So we've learned that, we're still divided, but the beauty about this is this is allowing a conversation. And if I can just speak to something Michelle said, is she was talking about how there was something about the forum. And I think, Michelle, you used the term, it was somewhat formal or something. And there was something about the forum. So we have a family member that, literally just, I will use past tense now, but thought I was a kook. And, and that my wife was just, kind of following my lead. And I mean, literally disdain. And relationships strained. And there's no way that you could, you wouldn't even dare to send this person, maybe a link to some video or something kind of explaining that maybe there's another narrative. But this person watched, I think 4 sets of these hearings. And now things have changed, and I think it's because of the forum. It was, it was quasi-judicial. Witnesses were sworn. They're being led by lawyers. They're being questioned by the commissioners. There was something about that gives everyone permission to watch.
Yeah, it was a genius idea, I must say. And I just want to say before I go back to you, Michelle, but one of the rear guard actions kind of still being fought is the release of garbage studies that are trying to impugn what we know with our own eyes. And here's what I mean. 2 weeks ago, a study was dropped and sent around social media by the usual narrative stitching suspects. And here's what the study claimed. The study claimed that COVID-19 was the #1 killer of children under a certain age. I can't remember. It's absolutely preposterous, ridiculous, didn't happen, couldn't happen. Johns Hopkins said they couldn't find a single kid without comorbidities who died of COVID. So we are here is the problem we have now. We have personal stories. We have credible science by people who know how to design a proper study. We have actually settled science on children, and they still will not let it go, right? The corruption in science still will not. They're still publishing stuff, the idea that vaccines save 10 million lives. I mean, it's just, and then you look at the study and it's just ridiculous. I mean, shouldn't even really be peer reviewed and published, but they are. And as long as those studies exist and are printed in the journals, they will not have to face what they've done here, because their supporters can also pull a garbage study off the internet and say, here, look, it killed hundreds of thousands of children, when no sane person actually thinks that anymore. That for me is very, very, very frustrating, I must say.
Yeah. You know, I admire your courage to look at that stuff.
Well, it shows up in my timeline, right? So I
have to say, you know, I admire your willingness to face that. I can't even look at that stuff. I find it so frustrating. It's an understatement, but
because an informational war is part of this, right? Like the one thing that I'm sure you guys do know about is that there's a piece in Blacklock's, which I think is the most underrated news organization in the country. They're terrific. Privy Council advocated downplaying COVID vaccine injuries or deaths. So under a FOIA request, they are acknowledging that there are significant vaccine injuries being reported. They don't dispute that. They weren't disputing it. This is an old document.
This is early on too, Trish. This is early on, remember?
Yeah.
And so meanwhile, Trudeau is out there saying safe and effective, and CBC is saying safe and effective. And here they are behind closed doors discussing all the problems with the vaccine. I mean, this is why we are all in a state of cognitive dissonance, because there is a truth, right? There is a truth, and truth is on the side of the people who are skeptical of what happened. Sorry, Sean, I had a little moment there.
Well, it's just, you know, when you start saying safe and effective, I mean, you go to Health Canada has a page for every vaccine. So, you know, you go to the Pfizer COVID vaccine page, and they all start with the same sentence, and it's something to the effect that, you know, all vaccines approved of by Health Canada are proven to be safe, effective, and of the highest quality. And if it's said, and that's just an absolute lie. I don't know if you saw my testimony in Quebec City, but I walked people through the fact that the regular drug approval test, where you do look at safety and efficacy, was replaced for the COVID-19 vaccines. Excuse me. So for the COVID-19 vaccines, a test was used that not only was safety not a requirement to be proved, but the word safety isn't even mentioned. And not only did you not have to prove that there was any efficacy, that is, that it worked, but words like efficacy or that it worked, those aren't even mentioned. So what happened is Health Canada was given a political test to use that had nothing to do with safety and efficacy. So, you know, the evidence is very clear from the Pfizer dump that it wasn't safe and it wasn't effective. But even a bigger lie to the Canadian public is that, you know, this messaging that it's been, you know, proven by Health Canada to be safe and effective. Well, that's just such a complete fraud. And, you know, it could take us decades to unravel this, but they have to keep going, Trish. They have to keep going with their fake studies. They have to keep going with, you know, pushing all this narrative, because as soon as they pulled that COVID trigger, where, you know, they have to go for broke, because otherwise they're all going to end up in jail, and they don't want to end up in jail.
Yeah, it's actually too the scandal is so huge. I guess what's frustrating for me is the idea that, you know, my old show, on which we did do some pharmaceutical products liability reporting, should be ripping this whole narrative apart. That's what the Fifth Estate did. That's what, you know, W5 should be doing. So should the Globe. And I mean, they all should be on this, and they're not. And they're not because they were complicit. And they cannot clean their slate until the managing editors of those organizations step forward and they say, we did a bad thing for what we thought was a good reason. Please forgive us. And now we're going to rectify it by becoming journalists again. They have to do that, but they're not going to, in my view. But this is why I lost some sleep at night during COVID, not just because of the thing itself, but watching my former industry tie themselves in knots. And of course, Marianne Cloack testified to that too, didn't she? How did she do, Michelle? How did Marianne do? I didn't actually see her evidence.
Oh, it was tremendous. What was so interesting about her evidence was that she took us through the whole process of how things shifted, how her job completely shifted, how the latitude she was given, you know, as a senior reporter, she made her own decisions, how that was completely taken away. And she said it was as if everything changed overnight. But to hear, like, you know, she's a really good journalist, so she had very good notes. She took us through each moment, all the decisions that were made, what her responses were. So we got to experience it, you know, how this could happen, because it seems incomprehensible how it could happen.
Yeah.
But that's, you know, it was like, in real time almost.
Yeah. Very, very difficult. I know Marianne, and I know that it was hard for her to come forward the first time when she spoke to us ages ago. And I'll tell you something, I'm really glad she talked to you, because she was somewhat disheartened that her evidence to me didn't have more of an effect, right? And I think it was too early. I think you guys' timing was perfect, that when she got up there and was seen to be under oath, that what she was saying really landed. And I'm glad of that, because she was kind of down that people were not, I mean, the story was picked up a bit when she was on my show, but not as much as it should have been, and as much as it was after she appeared at the commission. And then that 1-2 punch of she and Rodney Palmer, who I had on talking about his evidence there, was extraordinary. I mean, wow, they really blew the lid off the absolute abdication of responsibility by the legacy media in this country, specifically CBC. It's just shocking.
No, it was powerful. And and who knows where it's gone. I know that Greg Hunter, USA Watchdog, I mean, he picked it up. Who knows who else picked it up? And and his viewership's larger than CNN, if I recall correctly. But
everybody's is these days.
I was going to say,
I guess that's not saying much, which is a beautiful thing, isn't it? And but I found her. I echo what Michelle said. Is I just found her testimony to be really, really powerful. And it's curious because you don't know what's going to resonate, but the issue about journalists and the censorship is something that is really resonating. And, so it's a topic that I guess we should keep on, and that you should keep on, Trish.
Well, I can't help myself because it's driving me crazy. Like I'm like, what are you doing? Why are you not practicing journalism the way it should be the bulwark between, the public and the regulatory agencies but all of a sudden they're all in. I think, it's a new day. I think, this, Rodney talked about them, the Trusted News Initiative is a disaster. And Rodney kind of brought that to the fore. It's just, there's so much that needs reforming right now. I don't even know where to begin. So like you guys, I just slice off my little piece of the pie and do my podcast, and we've got a documentary film coming out as well. And that's all I can do, because if I think too long and hard about all of the institutions of democracy that have failed us in the last 3 years, I might go a little bit mental.
Well, not to sound cynical, but I don't know that it's reformable. I don't know if the legacy media is reformable. I think that people like you doing this independent work. I mean, we're just laughing about the fact that, everybody has a bigger audience than CNN. I was sitting beside the guy from Trucker Magazine. He has a bigger audience than CNN.
Yeah.
I think the landscape is changing, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And that what's happening right now is that people are building alternatives in all areas. And maybe that's the phoenix rising from the ashes. Maybe that's what this is all about.
Well, my fear is that people will curate the same way on the other side. That's my fear, is that I think we win when we're back to a news platform that we can all, no matter what side we're on, have confidence in, right? And so that hasn't happened yet. I don't think there's a lot of, I suppose Matt Taibbi is probably like that, and Glenn Greenwald and those guys, and Michael Schellenberger. and I don't know what their I know that Matt Taibbi was a lefty, as was I for most of my life. And now he's changed, I think, his views on that. But we have to get to a place where there is a reasonably neutral platform that people can trust,
Yeah, well, and I think that you see that I think being a mainstream journalist is going to become very uncomfortable going forward.
Yeah.
Because none of this could have happened without the journalists. I mean, we are in an information war. And, if 2 or 3 years down the road, we say, yeah, we were in a full-blown informational war and it caused a lot of deaths. And, how could we have stopped this at the beginning? It would have been blowing up the transmitters, like taking down the infrastructure for the mainstream media to be able to communicate, because this could not have happened without them. And they fully participated. And, they didn't leave any stop. They pulled out all the stops. And, I think, like you said, well, the major editors and that have to come forward and say, oh, well, we got this wrong, but the right reasons. If we get our institutions back, Trish, I honestly can't see any of them not being in jail.
Yeah. I don't necessarily disagree with that. I guess I kind of liken it. Maybe I don't. I think I do liken it a bit to the Iraq War, which everybody knew. I mean, I knew there was no weapons of mass destruction because I was reading the right stuff. And when they apologized for it after sending all those kids to a misbegotten disaster and sending them home with no limbs, they did publish paragraphs of apology, but not really. And they don't really change their stripes because they always side with those people anyway. So there is a cultural issue around the news media too, and the managerial class now that we've got to deal with. And it's very clear that they hate anybody who challenges the class of people that they now consider themselves to be. Journalism used to be a blue collar, not super blue collar, but kind of blue collar. They didn't have, I don't have a journalism degree. Back in the day, you didn't need one, right? So there is a kind of a class war, I think, going on between the journalists and the citizenry at this point, and that's where the danger is, right? It's an us and them kind of scenario.
But in all fairness, they put us in that scenario.
Oh, for sure. I totally agree. The way that the CBC covered the truckers, for instance, was so grotesque and so dishonest. There's a guy named Ray McGinnis, who I talk about fairly frequently on the show, who wrote a piece for Covert Action magazine about the truckers and the POEC. And what he uncovered is absolutely shocking. And again, it was a situation that was enabled by legacy media. They would never have gotten away with the smear campaign, which Trudeau initiated, without the support of the legacy media. It's so true. It's so true. Yeah. Michelle, I want to talk to you about what you think the future holds. You've done this big event. You've recorded a lot of testimonies. People are waking up as a result of what you did. What's next?
Do you mean what's next for the country? Like, where do I think this is going? Because I think that we have passed the point. Like, I mean, when I say we're in an informational war, I mean, I truly think we are in an information war. And, this COVID is just one part of what's going on. We're losing our freedoms. And so, like, let's talk even just about these digital passports that they want to come down. So they're it's almost like you're in a prison cell and the gate is or the door is being closed. And so I think we're past the point where to get our institutions back, we can do that painlessly. So I think there's going to be a large number of us that are going to pay a big price to do this. But I think we are going to get them back. And so, like, I'm extremely hopeful. And I think that just because of all the damage that we've done on so many levels, physical, spiritual, mental, the whole thing, that we've got a lot to go through. But I'm actually very optimistic because society does this. I mean, we become complacent, and then, people take power that, greed and other motives, and bad things happen. And then we have to realize, wait a second, we as a citizenry need to take personal responsibility, and we get things back on track. So I'm very hopeful. And I think, but the trick is every single person starting to take personal responsibility for what they're doing. And it's not the responsibility of groups like the NCI or other freedom groups. You have to decide personally, what are you doing?
Yeah. And I think getting together in rooms, I've started saying this on the show a lot, that we have to be together in rooms talking about this. What do you think, Michelle?
Yeah, Sean's echoing a comment I made earlier about responsibility. And I think that's exactly right, that what's required now is a whole new way to participate in society. And most of us did not participate in on a larger scale, and it's not an option anymore. I'm also optimistic for the outcome. I don't know that we're going to get our institutions back. I don't know that.
Yeah.
I can't believe I'm saying that. I mean, certainly 2 years ago, I would have said that was crazy, but I think we are in a biblical moment, and I don't know what that's going to look like, but I do think that something great will come out of all this. I just don't know how or what that looks like.
A lot of people saying what you just said, and I am not optimistic, only because I feel like the phrase you used about information war is so prevalent that without the ability to access credible information, without us all curating our information in a similar way, so we live in the same world, we have a big problem. And I think they knew that. One of the biggest regrets of my life is that I ever gave my kids cell phones. I wish I never did it. I'm a late adopter of a cell phone. I don't use it for anything really but talking on the phone and looking at my social media. But I think it's the devil. And I think it was a big contributor to what's happening now, that we're all kind of living in separate informational worlds.
Yeah.
And living off the tweaks of sorry, go ahead.
Right. I'm sorry. I'm just so agree with you. I think we're completely siloed by our information.
Yeah. So you guys went to how many cities? 8 or 10?
8.
8. Can you give me a flavor of how those places differed? Like, was there a theme amongst all of the cities, or were some more emotional or dramatic than others? Like, which places stood out, and for what reason did they stand out?
You go ahead, Sean.
Well, I was just thinking, I wouldn't describe any one as being more emotional, but what became really clear, Trish, is that every province had a different experience. So, let's just use Manitoba as an example. Like, Winnipeg had a little, truckers thing happen in Winnipeg, which was a different experience. And one of the things the NCI did, although, we only played a fraction of them, is we had before each hearing kind of 4 or 5 6-minute montages of news reporting during COVID put together. And I remember, and so let's say we might, if we've got a gap or a breaker, we might do it, when we come back from lunch, we'd play one. And just using Manitoba as an example, like their government would be using terms, what was the term, Michelle, for somebody who's a snitch? An ambassador. An ambassador. So, so they wouldn't call them a snitch, but they're basically, here the government is encouraging people to be good ambassadors, and basically to turn, your friends and family in for, violating the rules. And every province then had a different flavor and a different experience. So that in itself is an eye-opener. Like, if somebody's watching the NCI, you will notice each province has a different flavor.
That's really interesting. Ambassador for snitch. That's really very
Isn't
well.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like he couldn't do better.
But you see how far we can fall if they scare us enough and change the language enough that we don't realize we're being tyrants, do we? Because they're saying it's a good thing. I mean, human beings can be weak under certain circumstances.
I would say also that people like, one-upping other people. Like, a large part of my career has been running interference for natural health companies and against Health Canada. And Health Canada is complaint driven. Well, most complaints are by competitors, right? So, and just the fact, like when the wall fell, the East Germans learned that, their friends and family had been reporting them to the Stasi. Like that's an ugly part of us. And we've learned that Canadians are no different. We're
snitchy, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. I interviewed someone on the show, a woman named Ann Bauer, who, is Jewish. And we've talked a bit about how there is a similarity, not in the Holocaust times. That's not an example I would make myself, just because I don't feel it's my purview to do that. But in the years running up to the Holocaust, there was a lot of similar kind of co-opting of medicine and science, and not just the psychopaths like Mengele. Like regular scientists and doctors were the biggest group of people to join the Nazi Party in the 5 years before the Holocaust. And so I was making some of these parallels because it felt that important to me at times. I mean, I really did feel quite scared. And Ann Bauer said that she did too. She is Jewish. And she said, it made me think of what my parents always said to me about how to choose my friend. And she said that they told her to always make sure that person would hide you in the attic. And I said that a lot on the show, but I just think it's so chilling and true. And I saw a lot of people who wouldn't hide other people in the attic. They would turn them in a minute. And that was very, very destabilizing for me.
Absolutely. And I think, part of our collective trauma is how destabilized all of or many of our relationships became, because we recognized that. We also saw people just cut other people out of their lives because their opinions differ. Yeah. I mean, it is incredibly destabilizing. And wasn't that the point?
Absolutely. So how are you guys doing? Are you back into a normal routine after this very, very intense number of weeks, or how are you doing?
I actually don't know how to do normal. I don't know what that is anymore. I think I was talking to Teresa just the other day, saying I think we're all feeling destabilized. I think it's hard to figure out what to do next. And that's not even, I'm not even complaining about that. Because I want to say that, like Sean, this was the greatest thing I've ever done in my life. This was an incredible privilege. It's an incredible honor, and it continues to be, and it will continue to be a part of my life. So absolutely no regrets, no complaints. There's just what there is to deal with. And that is, how do we find normal in a world that is not normal?
Yeah.
I don't know the answers yet.
It's a very, very difficult question. What would you say to that, Sean?
Well, as far as, how to find normal, I think we're living in a world that's a complete fraud, where again, there are whole groups of people we can't have a conversation with, and our media and government and institutions are still lying to each other. And, doctors are still having to face issues of, professional misconduct and stuff like that. Was it this week or last week that German doctor was sentenced to 2.5 years in jail for basically giving exemptions during COVID? Well, why are we doing that in 2023? It's so that the next time they're trying to impose something on us, not a single German doctor will stand up. So there is no normal. But, going back to what happened, after the NCI, the experience was so profound. When summer camp ends, and it's been a really good one.
Yeah.
So I think, Michelle and I and I know the commissioners too, because they traveled together and had a very unique role, and deeply bonded with each other. So you all have this like extreme letdown where we've just been totally running on adrenaline. Like Michelle, you worked from dusk to dawn.
Yeah.
And I worked from dusk to dawn. Like I was having to get witnesses prepped and so you're all running on adrenaline. And so you're having a physical crash afterwards.
Yeah.
You're having a spiritual crash and emotional crash because of all this emotion that you've experienced. And then you're feeling sad because, summer camp's over. This beautiful experience has ended. And I don't know. I felt a little lost. Like the NCI, its plan was, let's run the hearings. Let's get the commissioner's report, which, hasn't happened yet. Let's catalog and archive what we've done so we've got a permanent record. But there was never any intention to continuing on or anything like that. But yet it has been such a positive experience for so many people that like now the question's being asked, but it's not settled yet. So like I'm feeling literally lost with the project. But like Michelle not complaining, it was just so powerful and so beautiful. But it's kind of like, what's happening now?
Yeah.
So,
I just want to say, Sean, I think as I'm listening to you, I'm remembering the opportunity of it because as you said, God put us in these places and guided this process. I mean, this is not something I would have said even a year ago, but it's clear to me that everything leading up to this was just perfect. It was like a perfect alignment. And I think that's continuing to happen in many places, that there's an alignment happening, and the opportunity is for us to continue to trust that. Because none of it made sense. Like everything I've done over the last year and a half has not made sense. It's not been practical.
Yeah. And yet you're right where God wants you to be.
That's how I feel.
Well, you know what I think part of the problem is? Part of the problem is that, just coming back to media, that they are not ascribing damage to the things that did the damage. So when they say teen suicide is up due to the pandemic, no, it's not. It's up due to the public health policy. It's not up due to the virus. They're not committing suicide over the virus, right? Or the economy's tanking because of the pandemic. No, not true. It's tanking because of the policy, not because of, right? So they're not acknowledging any of the stuff that you guys experienced, and they're not acknowledging it because they're complicit in it, right? So they will try and kicking and screaming, as we talked about earlier, about these stupid studies that they'll promote that said children were dropping dead of COVID, which they weren't. It's really, really hard because you've now looked into the abyss. You've seen it's real. You've seen the pain, and yet you inhabit a world where the main kind of purveyors of information are not talking about it.
Yeah. And not only not talking about it, but they're either ignoring it or they're saying, or they're lying.
Or they're lying. Yeah.
There's another thing. There's so many things that I never thought I would say or think, a year or two or three ago. And one is that they're lying.
Yeah.
It's not a bias. They're lying.
Well, it's crazy.
And that's something we have to come to terms with as well.
So when you say that the kind of the spirit of the NCI is alive, what does that mean? You've got a report coming, Sean, and then what? Will there be more hearings, or will there be more activities of some sort? What will you do?
Trish, just bearing in mind that I'm just, one voice of a group that makes those decisions. We don't know. So, we're still, and there's still a lot to do. So, we had 325 witnesses under oath. We haven't even gotten all of the videos, like the good quality videos, cut and put up. We've got volunteer teams. I think it's a team of 70. They just said, we will do this, and they organized themselves, preparing transcripts. And, there's another team, to revamp the website so that each witness has their own page. And so it'll link to their video. It will link to the transcript.
That's a big job.
Link to exhibits. And it will be searchable so that, if anyone just goes there and searches a term, that it's in a very helpful way, kind of list, all the witnesses and documents. So, Yeah, and that's all being done by volunteers. And it's so, I mean, all of these beautiful things are happening and we're still growing. Like, so on social media and that, the teams are still working. And so, you know, Michelle and those people are just going to have to figure out, well, how do we keep the momentum going and what does it look like going forward? But as far as, you know, further like in-person hearings and things like that, that's still yet to be decided. I could definitely see that happening.
Yeah.
You know, but so yeah, your listeners can, you know, pray for us that we get direction and know what we should be doing.
And Sean, can you just, since I have to talk about it later, describe this small initiative that I think is could be very powerful?
Oh, yeah. You mean the July 1st one?
Yes.
Yeah. So Trish, one of the challenges we have is we want to get people watching we've got this tremendous video record. So for July 1st, you know, by then we're going to have on our website this, you know, one page for people to just run off their printer. It'll be, you know, grayscale friendly. And I think Canada is 157 years old. Or 156, it was 1867. So yeah, 156. So we'll want people to print out 156 of these and put them in mailboxes around their neighborhoods. And if we get enough people doing that, and it'll just be very simple, like, you know, this is what Canada is. And we've had this National Citizens Inquiry. Basically, you know, see what your fellow citizens are saying and experienced. Like just randomly pick a day and watch 3 videos. And that came from one of the volunteers that has just been so helpful in, you know, clipping videos as we were going along and time was of the essence, said, you know, I really wasn't interested in this at all. And then somehow we ended up watching 3 testimonies. And he said, after that, it's like you're addicted. Like, it's funny, like people who had no intention of following us and watching found themselves watching every single day as much as, you know, their lives would permit, because it's addictive. So if we can get people watching, just picking randomly any day and watching 3 witnesses, they're going to be hooked. And, you know, once you watch a day, and I've said it several times during the proceedings, you're not the same person. You watch a full day of the NCI, and just pick any day, it doesn't matter. You're not the same person at the end of that day.
It's so true. And it's funny because one of the blogs, so I was writing a blog, a summary of each set of hearings. So I've now written 8 blogs, stories, where I've outlined and linked all the, you know, the most compelling. I mean, I hate to rank any of it because it all deserves to be seen, but the most compelling testimony with little description. So first of all, I'm thrilled to hear about the searchable stuff because I've just been sending people, you know, or sending links of my blogs to say, okay, well, go through this. You'll get summaries of everything as a solution for now. But there was something I was going to say about what you said. So in one of my blogs, I said, like, think of this like a TV series, right? Like each set of hearings is a season, and it is the most compelling thing you'll ever watch. And you will laugh and cry because at some points, some of it is so absurd and we just have to laugh.
Well, you cannot keep, I mean, this is kind of reverting back in a sense. It's maybe a modern day version of pamphleteering, but, you know, we have to get around the legacy media too. And that's what you've done. And that's what's going to save us, is getting around. We either do it in person by going to a hearing or going to an event. And I'm being asked to speak more and more at public events around COVID where people are just saying, screw it. I don't care what the CBC has to say about this anymore. I want to hear from so-and-so, right? And then there's the advantage also of being in a room with people who don't think you're awful for thinking the way you think. That's very much a part of this. And so I think you got, right? And you guys have really come up with it. I mean, just, you know what? Look, this is the time. I tell people who are struggling, just do what you want to do. Don't wait for it to be perfect. Don't wait for it to be all thought through. Just take the steps and do the thing. If it's starting a podcast, fine. If it's doing a thing like your hearings, fine. If it's, you know, tutoring kids who lost days of school, then do that. But the time for inaction is over. right? We have to now do the things we dream of doing to fix this problem. We've got to keep on going. And that is, to quote my mother, small steps for little feet, but you've got to take the steps, don't you?
That's what I love about this initiative, right? It's like distribute flyers in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
This is something everybody can do. And if it's scary, good. Because we are at the point now where we have to go way beyond what's comfortable.
Yeah. Sean, did you ever think it would get the way it has? Because in my very brief part of it, way back at the beginning, for a few weeks only, because I was much too busy to go on. And then the wonderful Michelle took over, which is a blessing anyway, because she's obviously fantastic at it. But I know there were money struggles at times, and there were struggles, right? Did you ever lose hope that it would end up being wonderful, or how did you? It's better than you even thought, right? Is it?
Oh, I couldn't imagine. I did not imagine how beautiful it would be, and it had nothing to do with us. I think it was purely God. I was praying that God would use the NCI as the light on the hill to basically, shine into the darkness and bring truth, right? And but there was lots of times of despair. Like you, Trish, know just how, a small group of volunteers, how disorganized we can be. And now looking back, it's like we didn't even know what you had to do to pull this off. So it's kind of we have to do this. And it's funny, I think the public has this impression that we're this big machine. I remember thinking, I saw some people online, they were complaining, nobody responds to my emails. And I want to say, you're right. Somebody should do that. Are you willing to do that? Because we don't have anyone to do that, right? There's just, the National Citizens Inquiry, they must have thought we were this big funded machine with, 100 employees or something, instead of this small little group of, 12 that, we're trying to organize this, and then, relying on just organizing groups of volunteers to do tasks, which is a real challenge. So, no, there were some really dark days. About 5 weeks before Truro started, I couldn't sleep. I went several days without sleeping because I was doing all I could to just, can I make this can we get this happening, right? Can we actually pull this together? We can hold hearings, but we have no social media. When we started Truro, we hadn't even had a Twitter account long enough to be verified. We had no followings, no social media, and then so we get our social media guy. Okay, you're our guy, and he's just volunteer at the time. Later on, we said we need you full time, and we don't pay him much, but we pay him some. But it's I was losing sleep because no one was stepping up to the plate to take on communications. And it's we can kill ourselves to hold hearings, but if no one watches.
No, exactly. No, that's key.
What's the point? Yeah. So actually it was my wife. She said, well, I'll give you a day, because we had no content. So she organized, I think about 12 witnesses getting interviewed so that we would have content, just their stories about COVID and things like that. And then she started putting teams together. And so, but I was, I was just fit to be tied several times. This was not an easy experience. And Trish, you were on the inside for a while. You just know how, we didn't know what we were doing.
No, I just have to add that, Sean said about Teresa, about his wife, as saying, I'll give you a day, which turned into every day, all the time.
Yeah.
She's still doing it.
Yeah.
But I think at the beginning, what you're talking about, Sean, was also the idea that everybody connected to this project had a sense of urgency and history about what you were doing. That's a hard thing to navigate, right? It was important to everybody. People weren't just kind of sleepwalking through the idea, everybody was very committed to it. So although that worked out in the end and made it better, it's hard to navigate groups of people who feel strongly about things, isn't it? Yeah.
At the same time, it's the most beautiful part, because none of this would happen and could have happened without people just deciding to volunteer. And I mean, there were some people, like, if I don't have permission to use his name, I should ask him, who was organizing the expert witnesses. Well, it was a dusk to dawn thing for months because it was such a huge task. And I mean, there's just so many people that just really gave. Look at Michelle. Michelle went to every single city, and we were there for 3 days. So for about a 4-month period, Michelle's life was completely taken over by the NCI. And it's like, well, when we're not having hearing days, I mean, she's having to get, her videos edited and clipped and put out and figuring, like, it was more than a full-time job. Well, Michelle volunteered. This like, do you understand? She wasn't getting paid. She volunteered her time to do this. And so at the hearings, she would be doing, like, a witness would testify, and then she would interview the witness, and lunch break, and, after the hearings, like, sometimes she couldn't go for supper till, 8, 9 o'clock at night, because she was interviewing witnesses, and to get kind of a more personal angle and a different angle than they had on the stand. And we could just give example after example after example. And I mean, that was touching. It's hard to manage, right? But it's incredible. I attended a Zoom call yesterday, and there were about, just shy of 30 of the team doing the transcript. Well, I mean, these people are working day in, day out, because for each witness's testimony, 3 different people will go through the transcript. So they, have AI generate it, and they've assured us that's just really not realistically, it's not close to being accurate. So you have 3 separate people vetting each transcript of each witness. I mean, they're going to be at it for months, and they're just going. Well, that's as we speak, they're doing this. It's beautiful.
Well, you've empowered people who were feeling powerless, right? That's what's happened. And that is a wonderful thing. Let me ask you just in closing here, because we're going to run out of time, but I would be bad at my job if I didn't ask you if you got any response at all from legacy media. I know CBC did a story in Alberta or Manitoba or something that was not, it didn't suck. So that was good. But did you get mainstream coverage? And if you did, was it fair?
Michelle, you can help me out here, because I think, wasn't that CBC one, which really was a non-story, but we're all thankful they didn't slam us? Wasn't that the only one?
That was it in terms of the mainstream. That was it.
Wow. Now it's interesting. I won't name them, Trish, but I mean, the reason why I brought Michelle into the hearings is we had a mainstream, but a kind of not the obvious ones, but a mainstream unit that could have gotten us some pretty good exposure, that was telling us they were interested. And so it's kind of like, well, we need a professional like Michelle to be watching the hearing, know what clips to pull to get edited so a news story could be done. Yes. And then, at the 11th hour after their board got involved, all of a sudden, they're not carrying us. But it was a blessing in disguise. And like Michelle was talking about how her life, basically everything had to fall into place. If they hadn't approached us, and they approached us, which prompted us to put together this team, it just would not have been the same experience for, the commissioners, for the witnesses, and for the record without having Michelle there.
Yeah, no, so I don't name the name of I think I know who you're talking about, but did they tell you why they backed out then at the end? I mean, what's the story there?
My recollection, and then I stopped chasing it after this meeting, was, so the person that, had engaged us and, was being very encouraging, and you guys, you need to put this into place and that into place. the last meeting, there's this other person there who, clearly does not understand how we view the world at all. And, and then the guy had been engaging us, said, well, the board's concerned about, were you on that call, Michelle?
I was on that call.
Yeah. So, it was kind of, it was upsetting. But I forget, do you recall how it was phrased? Because I think you got upset about it, saying, well, this is the news, right?
Yes. So what the situation was, which really baffled me, and was, so we were talking about the inquiry, and they were, the new person was saying, well, how do you vet your, for example, vaccine injured witnesses? What evidence do you have? And I said, I think you're missing the point. I said, if you were covering the Emergencies Act inquiry, would you be questioning how they vetted their witnesses, or would you just be covering the inquiry? And they had no answer.
Yeah, very true.
And what witnesses say. And, and it was interesting that he used that as an example, because we actually had a team of doctors that did vet the vaccine injured ones, because the concern the doctors had was, some people could be attributing a condition to a vaccine injury, but, unless you've really explored their background and other factors, it may not be realistic. So that's actually something that did happen because of doctors volunteering, that anyone who was vaccine injured that took the stand had been interviewed by a medical doctor to kind of parse out whether or not it was realistic.
Oh, well done. Yeah.
But Michelle's point is, like, Trish, when in history, in any country, have a group of citizens gotten together on any issue to hold their own public inquiry? I mean, we had 4 independent commissioners. It's really kind of funny now, because the NCI has, we want to push their recommendations, but we have no idea what the report's going to say, because there's this separation, right? So here we've got these independent commissioners. We're just with citizen, leadership and organization and funding, like literally it's like small donations. We're doing fine now. But I mean, when we were holding a hearing, it's like, if people aren't donating, we're not holding the next one, right? Like, we were biting our fingernails. Isn't that the story? And then just, well, what are the witnesses saying? Isn't that the story?
Yeah.
Well, I just want to, kind of comes full circle, because when we were I was in Truro, I actually did 4 stories for this particular organization to demonstrate what we could do. So these were very newsy stories, right? Me as a reporter, not like just my opinions, but they were very newsy stories. And they didn't know what to make of them. And for me, it just really, it's like talk about cognitive dissonance. They just couldn't understand that this was happening or why this was happening. So they literally could not understand the stories.
Wow. It boggles the mind. Well, that takes us back to the information warfare thing, where people are now so hypnotized by the idea of safe and effective that I can't think of another pharmaceutical product ever in history where people who might be injured by it are treated as shabbily as, I covered a ton. I covered breast implants that were causing problems. I covered IUDs. It was called a Delcon Shield, I believe, that was hurting women. I've never seen this before in my life as an investigative journalist. Of course you have to vet them. But what's the corollary to that? Do they actually think people are sitting around making up stories that they were vaccine injured? They want to really go through that just for fun to get on TV? It's absurd. But that's how compelling the propaganda war in favor of the pharmaceutical companies has been. It's almost complete. Let me ask you this, Sean. Did you respond in a second if you want to say something about that too? But I just want to also move on to the idea of accountability. Did you guys reach out to public health officials, to Theresa Tam's office, to people more locally and ask them? Yeah.
It's a great question. So if you're a government inquiry, you have the power to compel people to attend. You can issue them a summons. And if they don't attend, it's kind of like a contempt of court situation where they can be arrested and punished. because we're citizen run, we didn't have that. But we had similar rules as, a government inquiry, except without the powers. So we borrowed a summons form from another inquiry and just made it clear, well, this isn't binding, right? There's no civil or criminal consequence if you don't attend. But we sent summonses out to all the public health officials, Theresa Tam, ministers of health, and that should be up on our website. And if it's not, it will be. And at the last day in Ottawa, the lady, Lynn, who was tasked with sending those out, she testified about how many she sent and what she did and what the process was like. And so we really did try, Trish, to engage people, but we got some responses, but nobody willing to attend.
Wow. And were any of the responses moderately positive, where they said they want to see the report when it's done and you thought they might actually read it, or was it just BS?
Well, my recollection is most of them, no response at all. And then the responses we had, were, very polite things like, just declining or don't have time or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So, so clearly there was no interest from a public health officer to, being sworn and being asked questions under oath about, how they managed things during the pandemic.
And also, as Lynn pointed out in her emotional testimony when you asked her, that they're not interested in hearing from the citizens.
Yeah, that is true, isn't it? They're not interested in hearing from the citizens. We don't have a say in any of this stuff anymore.
Yeah.
It's not good. Yeah. Well, listen, you guys, I'm so grateful you did this. I'm a little bit ashamed and embarrassed that we didn't do it sooner, but we're doing it now. I want people to fully understand the magnitude of what you have achieved on behalf of the people in this country. And I hope it sits as a bit of a beacon of hope beside the trucker convoy story. And keep us in the loop. Let us know what the inquiry is doing, and we'll try to push along whatever your outcomes end up being so people know where to find them and that sort of thing. I'd be grateful.
Great, we'll do.
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity, Trish. And I'd like to just say two quick things. One is that this initiative, this old school handing out flyers initiative, is a way to not only keep the NCI alive, but it's actually a way to utilize what we've done and take it to a whole new level. Like, as Sean said in his closing statement in Ottawa, this is just the beginning. And the second thing is that there is interest being expressed from other countries. And this is something that we could export, that we could have NCIs. People could be holding this around the world. We could transform democracy itself.
Yeah. Well, the human heart requires exactly this kind of initiative. We are storytellers as a species. That's how we understand the world around us. And that's exactly what you guys did. So thank you for that. Anyway, have a good Friday night.
Yeah. Well, Trish, thanks for having us on, and thank you for what you do. We're all just kind of doing our part in this information war.
And I personally want to thank you for stepping down as the spokesperson.
Well, based on what you did and how well you did it, I think it actually worked out really well, because I would tell you something. I am burned out, and I don't have, after 3 years of fighting the fight, I don't have the stamina to do 12, 14 days. And I know exactly what that's like. As I said, like when you're sent off with a crew to Rwanda or the Alaska oil spill, whatever, that's what you do. It's super fun. It's super traumatic. You work long days. And I just, I'm not up for that after what's happened in my life in the last 3 years. Cause we started the podcast, I think in May of 2020, knowing that the public policy around COVID-19 was super hinky. And so it's been a 7-day a week. I've missed 2 shows in 3 years. And it was both times, I think it was because I had COVID. which I survived. I survived it, right? So yeah, the proof's in the pudding. But yeah, so it was not the right, especially the traveling part of it was definitely not the right thing for me. And it just sounds like you did a spectacular job. And Sean, you're right about the comms. Comms is everything these days, and finding ways around what legacy media is not saying or saying incorrectly. So it was a triumph to get her, and it was a triumph for you to put it together.
Well,
And,
I think God put her in our path. So I think, he brought the people that were needed when they were needed, and it's just so cool.
Absolutely. Okay, well, keep me in the loop, folks. Let me know what you're doing next. I know it'll be a great thing.
Great. Thanks, Trish.
Okay, guys, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
So that was Michelle Leduc-Catlin and Sean Buckley, two of the people responsible for bringing the National Citizens Inquiry to you all. They did, 8 hearings, 94 experts, 325 Canadians testified, 72,965 signatures. So, wow. And people were interested, I believe, as you heard us talk about, because it was generating a little bit of trucker energy, making people feel less hopeless about the future. And documenting these things is really, really important. So props to them in a big, big way. I just want to make a correction, because we do that stuff here, don't we? We're not like legacy media on this show. We admit when we were wrong. And I think I was wrong about something. I'm going to make a cagey partial correction. Last week, when we did the James Esses interview and a very, very detailed look into trans ideology capturing our children and how ludicrous it is. I mean, ludicrous in the sense that it's based on absurdities and not science. I read a little bit of a story by Bruce Arthur from the Toronto Star, who in my view has been wrong on every issue for the last 3 years, especially COVID. He's a sports reporter. The headline is, "A 9-year-old girl with short hair was bullied by adults." It's a warning about the anti-LGBTQ panic in Canada. I mean, how offensive is that, right? Last week on the show, there were certain teaching materials I was trying to describe, and I would say I was red-faced the whole time. I apologized about language, and they're showing that stuff to our kids, but we're not allowed to be mad about that. That's a panic. It is a bit of a panic, but it's not directed at trans people per se. It's about pushing obscenity into our children's curricula. That's what we're panicked about. And the fact that they don't seem to care what we think, that's also not good, right? So that's the headline. I hate it. It's so dishonest. Here's the cut line. "The anti-trans and other hateful views and policies that we're seeing in the U.S. are leaking into Canada." So to flip that, we would say the headline shouldn't be about the reaction to what they're doing. He should be reporting on the fact that these materials, this ideology is creeping into our country from across the border. But you see, you know what his bias is the minute you read the headline. I didn't even have to read the story. However, I did read it, and it is a narrative, and it was full of some detail. So I took it as truth. And probably shouldn't have. I probably should know better. But I did, just because it was so detailed. I thought there must be some truth to it. You think I'd know by now, wouldn't you? I used it to criticize the way these stories are written, and also the fact that journalists like Bruce Arthur and others, he's not the only one at all. I mean, most of legacy media does it. Instead of wondering why people are upset about what's going on in the schools, he attacks people for being upset about what's going on in the schools, right? So it's just what we've seen a million times before in this country with legacy media. After that episode last week, I got an email from somebody who said that the person who is being accused of being mean to a 9-year-old girl with short hair, who, according to Bruce Arthur, was bullied by adults, is absolutely categorically denying it. Completely denying that it happened in that way. And given how we know sometimes these things are kind of pushed into a certain narrative funnel, whether they fit or not. It's just as likely to me now that the person who's denying it is telling the truth is also worthy of credibility. I don't know. I haven't investigated it, but I am putting a giant caveat on the story that I read you last week. I should know better. Why do I ever trust them? Why? It's like Lucy and Charlie in the football, right? I mean, yeah, it's ridiculous. So I'm making a slight correction there. And I will say to you, in the meantime, stay critical. See ya.